Section number 27 of the Mary Frances Storybook. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Storybook by Jane Eyre Fryer. Sir Galahad continued. The gentlewoman risks her life for another. When they had achieved the adventure of the mysterious sword, they returned to their own ship, and the wind arose and drove them out to sea at a great pace. All that day and night they went before the south wind, and on the morrow came to the borders of Scotland, where they were forced to land, for they were without food. Here, after leaving the ship, they were attacked by wicked knights, because they were King Arthur's court, and had many other adventures, which are no part of this tale. Then on a day all heard a voice which said, Sir Galahad, thou hast well avenged me on God's enemies. Now hasten to the maimed king, that he may receive his health, for which he has waited so long. On the way they came to a castle which belonged to a gentlewoman who had lain for many years under a strange malady which no doctor could cure. But an old man had said, if she were anointed with the blood of a maid who is a king's daughter, she would recover her health. Now, said Sir Percival's sister, when she heard this, fair knights, I foresee that this gentlewoman will die, unless she have part of my blood. Straightway the knights opposed her, and Sir Galahad said, Certainly, if ye bleed so much ye will die. Truly, said she, if I die to heal her, I shall have great honor and soul's health, and I shall do it tomorrow. And nothing they said could change her. The next day, after they had heard service, Sir Percival's sister bade them bring the sick lady. Then she said, Who will let my blood? So they brought a doctor who did as she desired, but she bled so much that the dish was full, and no one could stop it. Then she said to the sick lady, Madam, if I come by my death to make you well, for God's love pray for me. With that she fell into a swoon. Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors quickly lifted her up and tried to staunch her blood, but she had bled so much that she could not live. When she awoke out of her swoon, she said, Fair brother, Sir Percival, I must die for the healing of this lady, so I require that you bury me not in this country, but as soon as I am dead, take me down to the sea, put me in a boat, and let me go as adventure will lead me. And as soon as you three come to the city of Sarras, there to achieve the Holy Grail, you will find me arrived under a tower, and there bury me in the spiritual place, for there Sir Galahad shall be buried, and you also, my brother, in the same place. When Sir Percival heard these words, he promised her, weeping, and her soul departed from the body. As they knelt beside her, they again heard a voice, which said, Tomorrow, early, you three shall separate from each other till the adventure bring you to the maimed king. The same day the sick lady was healed, but she sorrowed exceedingly for the death of the maiden. Sir Percival wrote a letter telling how his sister had helped them in strange adventures, and put it in her right hand. Then the knights carried her to the sea and laid her in a boat and covered her with silk, and the wind arose and drove the boat from the land, and they all watched till it was lost in their sight. Then they returned to the castle, and forthwith there fell a sudden tempest of thunder, lightning and rain that shook the earth, and even song was past ere the tempest ceased. On the morrow the three knights separated and each went his own way. Sir Galahad meets a knight in white armor. The story says that after Sir Launcelot rode into the forest after Sir Galahad and was lost, he escaped many perils, but at last came to the water of Mortis as the night was falling. Not knowing what to do, he lay down to sleep and await what adventure God would send him. When he was asleep, he heard a voice in a dream, which said, "Launcelot, rise up, take thine armor, and enter the first ship thou shalt find." When he heard these words, he rose up and set out toward the sea. By good fortune he found a ship which was without sail and oars, and saw no one. As soon as he was on shipboard, he was filled with joy such as he never felt before, and in this joy he lay down and slept till daylight. When he awoke, he was astonished to see there was a fair bed in which lay a dead gentlewoman. As he looked, he saw in her right hand Sir Percival's letter, which told who she was, and what she had achieved. There Sir Launcelot spent some days, not knowing what to do. One night, as he was sitting on the shore, he heard a horseman coming that way and waited to see what would happen. The rider, who seemed to be a knight, rode to where the ship was, alighted, and went on board. Sir Launcelot went toward him and said, "Sir, you are welcome." The other returned his salute and asked his name. "For," said he, "my heart goes out to you." "Truly," said Sir Launcelot, "my name is Sir Launcelot of the Lake." "Sir," said the other, "then you are welcome, for you were the beginning of me in this world." "Ah, are you Sir Galahad?" "Yes, in truth." With that Sir Galahad leaped to the shore, kneeled down, and asked Sir Launcelot's blessing, and then took off his helmet and kissed him. With great joy they told of the marvels and adventures that had happened to them since they left the court. Sir Galahad told of the high honor of Sir Percival's sister, that she was the best maid living, and that her death was a great pity. When Sir Launcelot heard how the marvelous sword was gotten, he asked to see it, and kissed the hilt and the scabbard. "Truly," said he, "I never heard of such high and strange adventures before." So Sir Launcelot and Sir Galahad spent many days together in the ship, and served God daily and nightly with all their power, and often the ship carried them to far islands, where they met with many strange and perilous adventures. Upon a Monday it happened that they landed at the edge of a forest which was by the sea. Standing by a cross of stone, they saw a knight on horseback, armed all in white, who held by his right hand a white horse. He came to the ship, saluted the two knights, and said, "Sir Galahad, you have been with your father long enough. Leap upon this horse and ride where adventure shall lead in quest of the Holy Grail." Sir Galahad turned to his father and kissed him full courteously, and said, "Father, I do not know that I shall see you again till I find the Holy Grail." "I pray you," said Sir Launcelot, "that you will pray our Father in heaven to keep me in his service." Sir Galahad mounted his horse, and then they all heard a voice that said, "Think to do well, for the one shall never see the other till the dreadful day of doom." "Now, my son Sir Galahad," said Sir Launcelot, "since we shall never see each other again, I pray the High Father of Heaven to preserve both you and me." "Sir," said Sir Galahad, "no prayer avails so much as yours." So saying, he rode into the forest, and his father saw him no more. The knight in white armor then vanished as he came, and Sir Launcelot returned to the ship, and the wind arose and drove him many days across the sea to a distant land. Soon after that he left the ship, which kept on its lonely journey, until at last it arrived at the city of Sarras with its fair burden. Now Sir Launcelot began to long for the realm of Britain, which he had not seen for a year and more. So, commending himself to God, he rode through many countries and came at last to Camelot. Here he found King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, but many of the knights of the Round Table were missing, for already more than half of them had been slain. However, Sir Gawain, Sir Ector, and Sir Lionel had returned, and many others who had failed in their quest of the Holy Grail. All the court was exceedingly glad to see Sir Launcelot, who told of his adventures since he had departed, and also those of Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors, which he knew by the letter of the dead gentlewoman and from Sir Galahad himself. "Now, would God," said the king, "that all three were here." "That cannot be," said Sir Launcelot, "for two of them you shall never see, but one of them shall come again." Sir Galahad achieves his quest, and bears the Holy Grail across the sea. Now after Sir Galahad bade his father farewell and entered the forest, he rode many journeys in vain. At last he found his way out of the forest, and rode 5 days toward the castle of the maimed king, and ever Sir Percival followed after till he overtook him, and they went on in company. At a cross roads they met Sir Bors, who was riding alone, and so to their great joy the three knights were together again. "In more than a year and a half," said Sir Bors, "I have not slept 10 times in a bed, only in wild forests and mountains, but God was always with me." Thus they rode a long time till they came to the castle of Carbonek, where lived Pelleas, the maimed king, who was the grandfather of Sir Galahad. When they entered the castle hall, a bed was brought in whereon lay the good old man they had come to see. They had come far to see. King Pelleas was very happy, for he knew that the quest of the Holy Grail was about to be achieved. "Sir Galahad," said he, lifting up his head, "you are welcome, for I have long prayed for your coming. But now I trust that my suffering shall be allayed." Eleazar, King Pelleas' son, then brought the broken sword with which Joseph was wounded in the thigh after he came to Britain. Sir Bors took the two pieces and tried to force them together again, but he could not. Then Sir Percival tried, but he had no more power than Sir Bors. "Now it's your turn," they said to Sir Galahad, "for if an earthly man can achieve it, you can." Sir Galahad then took the pieces and set them together, and the sword seemed as if it had just been forged and never broken. When they recovered from their astonishment, they gave the sword to Sir Bors, for he was a good knight and a worthy man. A little before evening, a strange thing happened. The sword became wondrously heated, so that no one could handle it, and a voice was heard which said, "They ought not to sit at the table of our Lord arise, for now shall true knights be fed." So all went out save King Pelleas and his son and a maid who was his niece, And the three knights, and a table of silver was before them with the holy vessel covered with a cloth of silk. With that they saw 9 knights all armed come in at the hall door, who took off their armor and said to Sir Galahad, "Sir, we have ridden hard to be with you at this table." "You are welcome," said he, "but whence come you?" 3 of them said they were from Gaul, 3 from Ireland, and 3 from Denmark. Upon that a voice said, "Let these among you who are not in quest of the Holy Grail depart." So King Pelleas and his son and niece departed. As the knights sat waiting, it seemed to them that there appeared a man from heaven, before the table on which the Holy Grail was, and they saw letters in his forehead which said, "This is Joseph, the first bishop of Christendom, whom our Lord rescued in the city of Sarras." With him were angels, who bore a spear which bled marvelously. Then the knights wondered, for Joseph had died more than 300 years before. "O knights," said he, "wonder not, for at one time I was an earthly man. Now shall ye have such food as never knights tasted." When he had said this, he and the angels vanished, and they sat there in great dread. Then they looked and saw, as it were, another man enter, who said, "My knights and my servants who are come out of this earthly life, ye shall now see a part of my secrets and my hidden things." Then he took the holy vessel and proffered it to Sir Galahad, who kneeled down and partook, and so after him all the knights. "Galahad," said he, "dost thou know what I hold in my hands?" "Nay," said Sir Galahad, "unless ye tell me." "This," said he, "is the holy vessel in which I ate the last supper, but thou hast not seen it openly as thou shalt see it in the city of Sarras. Therefore thou must go hence and bear this vessel with thee. This night it shall depart from the realm of Britain to be seen no more, for it is not honored as it ought to be by the people of this land, who are turned to evil living. Therefore go tomorrow down to the sea, where you shall find a ship ready, and with you take the sword with the strange belt, and Sir Bors and Sir Percival. Also I will that ye take the blood of the spear and anoint the maimed king, and he shall have his health." Then he gave them his blessing and vanished away. Sir Galahad went at once to the spear which lay on the table and touched the blood with his fingers and came to his grandfather, the maimed king, and anointed him. Immediately he stood upon his feet, a whole man, and gave thanks for his healing. That same night, about midnight, they heard a voice that said, "Go ye hence as I bade you." "Lord, we thank thee," said they; "now may we prove ourselves worthy." In all haste they took their armor, ready to depart. Now the 3 knights of Gaul were great gentlemen, and Sir Galahad said to them, "If you come to King Arthur's court, I pray you salute my father, Sir Launcelot, and all the company of the Round Table." And they promised to do so. Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors then departed and rode 3 days, till they came to the seashore and found their ship. When they went on board, they saw the table of silver and the Holy Grail covered with cloth of red silk, and were exceedingly glad to have them in their keeping. Now, on the voyage Sir Galahad spent a long time in prayer, asking that he might pass out of this world. He prayed so earnestly that at last a voice said to him, "Galahad, thou shalt have thy request." Sir Percival heard this, and asked him why he prayed for such things. "That shall I tell you," said he. "The other day when we saw part of our adventure of the Holy Grail, I was filled with such joy as I suppose no earthly man could feel. Therefore, I knew well that when my body is dead, my soul shall have the great joy of heaven." Then he lay down and slept a great while, and when he awoke he saw before him the city of Sarras, and as they were about to land they saw the ship in which Sir Percival had put his sister. "Truly," said Sir Percival, "well has my sister kept her word." They first took out of their ship the table of silver and the holy vessel, and Sir Percival and Sir Bors went before, and Sir Galahad behind. At the city gate they saw a crooked old man. Then Sir Galahad called him, and bade him help bear the heavy table. "Truly," said the old man, "for 10 years I have not been able to walk without crutches." "Care not," said Sir Galahad; "rise up and show thy good will." On getting up he found himself whole as he ever was, so he ran and took hold with Sir Galahad. At once the report spread that a cripple had been cured by a strange knight that had entered the city. The three knights then returned to the water and brought Sir Percival's sister into the spiritual place, and buried her richly as a king's daughter ought to be. When the king of the city, who was called Estorause, saw the three comrades, he asked them who they were, and what they brought upon the table of silver, and they told him the truth of the Holy Grail. Now the king was a tyrant of heathen birth, and he took them and put them in prison in a deep hole. At the year's end King Estorause fell sick, and knew that he would die. Then he sent for the three knights, and asked pardon for what he had done, and they forgave him freely, and so he died. When the king was dead all the city was disheartened, and knew not who might be their king. As they were in council, there came a voice that bade them choose the youngest of the three knights. So they made Sir Galahad king, with the assent of all the people of the city. The first act was to have made a chest of gold and precious stones to cover the holy vessel, and every morning the three comrades came to the palace where it was kept and said their devotions. The passing of Sir Galahad, the end of Sir Percival, and the return of Sir Bors to Camelot. Now after Sir Galahad had been a king for a year, the three friends rose early, as was their custom, and came to the palace and saw the holy vessel and a man kneeling there, who had about him a great company of angels. He called Sir Galahad and said, "Come forth, good and faithful servant, and thou shalt see what thou hast much desired to see." Then Sir Galahad began to tremble greatly, for he knew his time had come. "Now," said the good man, "thou knowest who I am?" "Nay," said Sir Galahad. "I am Joseph of Arimathea, whom our Lord sent here to bear thee fellowship, for thou art like me more than any other in two things. One is, thou hast seen the Holy Grail, and the other is, thou hast been a blameless knight as I am." When he had said these words, Sir Galahad went to Sir Percival and Sir Bors, and kissed them and commended them to God, and said, "Salute me to my father, Sir Launcelot, as soon as ye see him, and bid him remember this unstable world." Then he kneeled before the table and prayed, and suddenly his soul departed, and a great company of angels bore his soul up to heaven. And his two friends saw a hand take the holy vessel and bear it up to heaven. Since then no man has ever been so bold as to say that he had seen the Holy Grail. When Sir Percival and Sir Bors saw Sir Galahad dead, they sorrowed as much as ever did two men, and if they had not been good men, they might easily have fallen into despair, and the people of the city sorrowed with them. As soon as Sir Galahad was buried, Sir Percival retired to a hermitage outside the city, and Sir Bors was always with him. Thus Sir Percival lived a year and 2 months, and then passed out of this world. And Sir Bors buried him by his sister, and Sir Galahad in the spiritual place. Now, when Sir Bors saw that he was alone in a far country, as far away as Babylon, he took his armor and departed from Sarras and entered a ship, and so at last came to the realm of Britain and to Camelot, where King Arthur was. On his return there was great rejoicing at the court, for they thought that he was dead, he had been so long out of the country. Then King Arthur sent for the best clerks to make a chronicle of the adventure of the good knights. Sir Bors told of Sir Percival and his sister, and of Sir Galahad and the Holy Grail. Sir Launcelot told what he had seen, and all the tales were written in great books and put in the armory at Salisbury. Sir Bors said to Sir Launcelot, "Sir Galahad, your son, saluted you by me, and after you, King Arthur and all the court, and so did Sir Percival, for I buried them with mine own hands, in the far city of Sarras. Also, Sir Launcelot, Sir Galahad bids you remember this unstable world, as ye promised when ye were together more than half a year." "That is true," said Sir Launcelot. "Now I trust to God his prayer shall avail me." Then Sir Launcelot put his arms about Sir Bors and said, "Gentle cousin, you are welcome to me, and all that ever I may do for you and yours, you shall find me ready at all times while I have life, and this I promise you faithfully, and never to fail you. And know well, gentle cousin, Sir Bors, that you and I will never separate while our lives shall last." "Sir," said he, "I will as ye will." "Sir Galahad was not the only knight who found the Holy Grail," added the Story Lady after a pause. "But I thought from the story," said Mary Frances, "that Sir Galahad and his two comrades were the only ones who were permitted to find it." "No, there were others," said the Story Lady. "Your own American poet, James Russell Lowell, tells of another, Sir Launfal, who found the Grail in a place he had never thought to look." The Story People listened eagerly, for they liked the tale of Sir Galahad so much they were ready for more. So the Story Lady told the tale of a fourth knight who succeeded. End of section 27. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section number 28 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Story Book by Jane Eyre Fryer. How Sir Launfal achieved the Holy Grail. Once upon a time there was a young knight, Sir Launfal, who had read of the success of Sir Galahad, and of the failure of many of the knights of the Round Table. This made him very eager to try his fortune, so he vowed that some day, too, he would set out in quest of the Holy Grail. Now Sir Launfal lived in a cold grey castle in the North Country, whose gates were never open save to knights or ladies of high degree, who were as proud and haughty as himself. One beautiful June day, Sir Launfal was in the happy mood which often comes to people after the passing of a cold, bleak winter, a day when it seems easy for the grass to be green, the sky to be blue, and the heart to be brave. On this lovely day Sir Launfal remembered his vow, and called his squire, and said, "Bring me my best armor and my golden spurs, and get my horse ready, for to morrow I shall set out over land and sea in quest of the Holy Grail." When the squire brought his shining armor, the knight put it on, and said to himself, "I will never sleep in a bed nor lay my head on a pillow till I have performed my vow." With that he lay down in the tall grasses by the brook, his golden spurs by his side, to think and plan what he would do. Slowly his eyelids closed, slowly sleep came upon him, and he dreamed, and this was his dream. It is summer. The crows flap their wings and fly by twos and threes overhead in the deep blue sky. The cattle stand in the shallow brook, and the water runs along with a sweet gurgling music. The little birds sing in the branches of the trees as if trying to burst their throats, telling of the joy of living. Even the leaves seem to sing on the trees. The earth is so beautiful and gay, but the castle stands encircled by its high walls and deep ditch full of water, proud and forbidding, untouched by the loveliness round about it. The drawbridge drops over the water with a surly clang, and through the dark arch across the bridge springs a charger bearing Sir Launfal, dressed in his gilded armor which gleams brightly in the sun. He is setting forth wherever adventure may lead him in quest of the Holy Grail. Just as he passes out, he is aware of a beggar who sits crouching by the dark gate. The beggar is a leper. He holds out his hands and begins an alms. The sight of so much misery fills the young knight with loathing, but he scornfully tosses him a piece of gold and rides on. Strange to say, the beggar leaves the gold on the ground and says, "Better turn away empty from the rich man's door and take the poor man's crust and his blessing than such a worthless gift as that." Now the scene changes. It is winter. There are no leaves on the bushes and trees. The bare boughs rattle shudderingly as the winds sweep through them. The brook is frozen over, and the cattle are huddled in their stalls. A single crow sits high up in a tree top in the wintry sunlight, and the cold snow covers the ground. At the castle gate stands a bent old man, worn out and frail. The wind rustles through his wiry gray hair, and blows through his ragged clothing. He peers eagerly through the window slits at the joyous scene within, for it is Christmas time, and then turns away. The bent old man is Sir Launfal. After many weary years he has returned to his castle disappointed, for he has not found the Holy Grail, and another Eayre, who thinks him long dead, rules in his place. He sinks down by the gate, and his mind wanders. He sees again the scenes of the desert, the camels as they pass over the hot sands, the vain search of the caravan for water, and then the slender necklace of grass about the little spring as it leaps and laughs in the shade. Suddenly he hears a voice. "For Christ's sweet sake, I beg an alms!" Sir Launfal is startled and looks around him. There at his side he sees the leper cowering, more wretched, more miserable, more loathsome than before. But he does not look at him in scorn this time. Instead he says, "I will share with you the little I have, for in giving you I shall be giving to him who has given so much for me." So he divides his crust of coarse bread, and gives half to the beggar, and goes to the brook, breaks open the ice, and gives him a drink of water from his wooden bowl. Then suddenly a light shines round about the place, and the leper no longer crouches at his side, but stands a glorified figure who says, "Lo, it is I, be not afraid. In many climes, without avail, thou hast spent thy life for the Holy Grail. Behold, it is here, this cup which thou didst fill at the streamlet for me but now. This crust is my body broken for thee, this water his blood that died on the tree. Not what we give, but what we share, for the gift without the giver is bare. Who gives himself with his alms feeds three, himself, his hungry neighbor, and me." Sir Launfal awoke, sat up, and rubbed his eyes, and looked about him. Here were the tall grasses, the brook, the cattle, just as he had left them when he went to sleep and dreamed. He was not in rags and tatters, but was a young knight clad in gleaming armor, his spurs at his feet. It was not winter, but a beautiful June day, with birds flying about, singing songs of gladness, and cattle browsing in the meadows. Sir Launfal quickly rose and made his way into the great hall of the castle, where every one met him with surprise. "Why, Sir Knight," said his sister, "we thought by now you would be far on your journey in quest of the Holy Grail." "I have found it," cried Sir Launfal, "here at my castle gate." Then he laid aside his arms and said to his squire, "Hang these idle weapons upon the walls, and let the spiders weave their webs about them. Whoever would find the Holy Grail must wear another sort of armor, the armor of unselfish kindness. Now the castle gates stand wide open, and those in need are as welcome there as the birds in the elm tree's branches. No matter what the weather outside, it is summer in the castle year round, for hearts are happy in giving and sharing the great blessings there bestowed, and the happiest of all is the good knight himself." "So you see, Sir Launfal found the Holy Grail, and he did something even better," said the Story Lady as she finished the tale. "He showed others how to find it." End of section 28. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section 29 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Story Book by Jane Eyre Fryer. The Stories of the Fourth Day. Music Bewitched. When all the Story People were assembled, the Story King in his place, Mary Frances in the blue velvet chair beside the Story Queen, the Ready Writer with pen upraised, The Story Lady began. Today we have 6 short stories. The first is about a schoolboy named Bob, and how he conquered his worst enemies. Bob's 3 Foes. Thud, thud, thud. Hit him in the eye. Knocked the pipe out of his mouth. Ha, ha, there goes his nose. I hit him that time. These dreadful sounds seemed to say that some barbarous piece of cruelty was going on, but the victim was only a snow man, which the boys of Strappington School had set up in their playground. Truth to tell, the snow man did not like it much, but boys cannot be expected to understand the feelings of a snow man. So he bore it very patiently, and when one snowball came in each eye, and a third in his mouth, he never spoke a word or flinched a muscle. But how was the schoolmaster to know that it was only a snow man? And what was more natural than that he should peep over the playground wall to see what was going on? And how was little Ralph Ruddy to know that the schoolmaster was there? And how was he to know that the snowball which was meant for the snow man's pipe would land itself on the schoolmaster's nose? Oh, the horror that seized upon the school at that dire event, and the dead silence that reigned in the playground! For those were the good old times of long ago, when anything that went wrong was set right with a birch rod. Little Ralph Ruddy knew only too well what was coming when the angry schoolmaster ordered him into the schoolroom. The snow man, of course, was left in the playground all alone. He saw the boys troop indoors, and heard some angry words and some cries of pain, and saw poor little Ralph thrust into the cold playground, and heard the door slam behind him, and stared without once turning his head or blinking his eyes, while the little fellow sat on the snowy doorstep, with knuckles screwed into each eye, and indeed the good snow man himself felt half inclined to cry, only the tears froze inside before they got out of his eyes, so he couldn't. When the bell rang at 4 o'clock, the boys came out, and among them Bob Hardy, the son of a poor farm laborer. "A cruel shame I call it," muttered Bob, "to whip a little chap like that, and then shut him out in the cold. I told him Ralph Ruddy never meant to do it, and then he caned me as well. A real brute I call him, and I'll pay him out, too. I declare I'll break his bedroom windows this very night, and let him try how he likes the winter wind." And Bob meant to do it, too. He climbed out of the cottage window when all were asleep, and made his way down to the schoolhouse by moonlight, with a pocket full of stones, and climbed the wall of the playground, and stood there all ready to open fire, when a voice startled him, a sort of shivering whisper. "Better not, Bob. Better wait a bit," said the voice. Bob dropped the stone, and looked about, but there was no one near except the snow man shining weirdly in the pale moonlight. However, the words, whoever spoke them, set Bob a-thinking, and instead of breaking the schoolmaster's windows, he went home again and got into bed. That was in January, and when January was done, February came, as happens in most years. February brought good fortune. At least Bob's mother said so, for she got a job as charwoman at the squire's, for which she was well paid. It did not turn out so very well, though, after all, for the butler said she stole a silver spoon, and told the squire so, and if the butler could have proved what he said, the squire would have sent her to prison, only he could not. So she got off, and Bob's mother declared that she had no doubt the butler took the spoon himself. "All right," said Bob to himself. "I'll try the strength of my new oaken stick across the butler's back." And he meant it, too. For that very evening he shouldered his cudgel and tramped away to the big house. And when he got there the door stood wide open, so in he walked. Now there hung in the hall the portrait of a queer old lady in a stiff frill and a long waist, and an old-fashioned hoop petticoat. And when Bob entered the house, what should this old lady do but shake her head at him. To be sure there was only a flickering lamp in the entry, and Bob thought at first it must have been the dim light and his own fancy, so he went striking through the hall with his cudgel in his hand. "Better not, Bob," said the old lady. "Better wait a bit." "Why, they won't let me do anything," grumbled Bob, but he went home without thrashing the butler, all the same. That was in February, you know. Well, when February was done, March came, and with it came greater ill fortune than ever, for Bob's father was driving his master's horse and cart to market, when what should jump out of the ditch but old Nanny Jones's donkey, an ugly beast at the best of times, and enough to frighten any horse. But what must the brute do on this occasion but set up a terrific braying, which sent Farmer Thornycroft's new horse nearly out of its wits, so that he backed the cart and all that was in it, including Bob's father, into the ditch. A pretty sight they looked there, for the horse was sitting where the driver ought to be, and Bob's father was seated, much against his wish, in a large basket full of eggs, with his legs sticking out one side and his head the other. Of course Farmer Thornycroft did not like to lose his eggs. Who would? For even the most obliging hens cannot be persuaded to lay an extra number in order to make up for those that are broken. But for all that Farmer Thornycroft had no right to lay all the blame on Bob's father, and stop 2 shillings out of his week's wage. So Bob's father protested, and that made Farmer Thornycroft angry, and then, since fire kindles fire, Bob's father grew angry too, and called the farmer a cruel brute, and so the farmer dismissed him, and gave him no wages at all. We can hardly be surprised that when Bob heard of all this he felt a trifle out of sorts. But the desire for vengeance which he felt could hardly be justified. He went pelting over the fields, and all the way he went he muttered to himself, "A cruel shame, I call it, but I'll pay him out. I mean to let his sheep out of his pen, and then I will go and just tell him that I've done it." Now the field just before you came to Farmer Thornycroft's sheep pen was sown with spring wheat, and they had put up a scarecrow there to frighten the birds away. The scarecrow was very much down in the world. His coat had no buttons, and his hat had no brim, and his trousers had only a leg and a half. His well-to-do relations in the tailor's windows would not have cared to meet him in the street at all. But even the ragged and unfortunate have their feelings, and the scarecrow was truly sorry to see Bob scouring across the field in such a temper. Just as Bob passed him, he flapped out at him with one sleeve, and the boy turned sharply round to see who it was. "Only a scarecrow," said he, "blown about by the wind," and went on his way. But as he went, strange to say, he heard, or thought he heard, a voice call after him, "Better wait, Bob! Better wait a bit!" So Bob went home again, and never led the sheep astray after all. But he thought it very hard that he might not punish either the schoolmaster, or the butler, or the farmer. Father Pan's Revenge. Now the folk that hid behind the shadows thought well of Bob for his self-restraint, and they determined that they would work for him and make all straight again. So when Bob went down the river side the next day, and took out his knife to cut some reeds for whistle pipes, Father Pan breathed upon the reeds and enchanted them. "What a breeze!" exclaimed Bob, but he knew nothing at all of what had in reality happened. Bob finished his pan pipes, and trudged along and whistled on them to his heart's content. When he got to the village he was surprised to see a little girl begin to dance to his tune, and then another little girl, and then another. Bob was so astonished that he left off playing and stood looking at them, open-mouthed with wonder. But so soon as ever he left off playing, the little girls ceased to dance, and as soon as they had recovered their breath they began to beg him not to play again, for the whistle pipes, they were sure, must be bewitched. "Ho, ho!" cried Bob. "Here's a pretty game. I'll just give the schoolmaster a turn. Come, that will not do him any harm, at any rate." Strange to say, at that very moment the schoolmaster came along the street. "Toot, toot! Toot, twiddle, twiddle, toot!" went the pan pipes, and away went the schoolmaster's legs, cutting such capers as the world never looked upon before. Gaily trudged Bob along the street, and gaily danced the schoolmaster. The people looked out of their windows and laughed, and the poor schoolmaster begged Bob to leave off playing. "No, no," answered Bob. "I saw you make poor little Ralph Ruddy dance with pain. It is your turn now." Just then the squire's butler came down the street. Of course he was much puzzled to see the schoolmaster dancing to the sound of a boy's whistle, but he was presently more surprised to find himself doing the very same thing. He tried with all his might to retain his stately gait, but it was all of no use. His legs flew up in spite of himself, and away he went behind the schoolmaster, following Bob all through the village. The best sight was still to come, for the tyrannical farmer Thornycroft was just then walking home from market in a great heat, with a big sample of corn in each of his side pockets, and turning suddenly round a corner, went right into the middle of the strange procession, and caught the infection in a moment. Up flew his great fat legs, and away he went, pitching and tossing, and jumping and twirling, and jigging up and down like an elephant in a fit. How the people laughed, to be sure, standing in the doorways and viewing this odd trio. It was good for them that they did not come too near, or they would have been seized with the fit as well. The schoolmaster was nearly fainting, the butler was in despair, and the perspiration poured down the farmer's face. But that mattered not to Bob. He had promised himself to take them for a dance all round the village, and he did it, and at length, When he had completed the tour, he stopped for just 1 minute, and asked the schoolmaster whether he would beg Ralph Ruddy's pardon. And the schoolmaster said he would if only Bob would lead off playing. Then he asked the farmer if he would take his father back and pay him his wages, and the farmer said he would, and finally he asked the butler if he would give up the spoon that he had stolen, and confess to the squire that Bob's mother had nothing to do with it. But the butler said, "Oh, no, indeed!" So Bob began to play again, and they all began to dance again, till at last the schoolmaster and the farmer both punched the butler until he promised, and then Bob left off playing. The three poor men went home in a terrible plight, and the schoolmaster begged little Ralph's pardon, and the butler cleared the stain from Bob's mother's character, and Bob's father went back to work, and Farmer Thornycroft soon afterwards took Bob on too, and he made the best farm boy that ever lived. The Story Lady rested a minute while the Story People were laughing and talking about what they had heard. As she began again, there was instant silence. "The next story," she said, "is that of a brave girl who lived in the work-a-day world." End of section 29. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section 30 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Storybook by Jane Eyre Fryer. Anne Catches a Thief. As a rule, the office in which Anne Carstairs was employed did not close until 6 o'clock, but at 5:30 on the December afternoon of this story, Anne found herself alone. At 4, the heads of the firm left for the day, and the billing clerk and the stenographer, taking advantage of the absence of authority, helped themselves to an extra half hour. "We have a little shopping to do," the billing clerk explained as they passed Anne's desk. Before they reached the stair door, the inside salesman closed his desk with a snap, and seized his hat and coat. "Wait a minute, girls," he called. "I'll take you down to Broadway in my machine." As he followed them he said to Anne, "Good night, Miss Carstairs. Don't stay late." A few minutes after they had gone, Mr. Bradford, the bookkeeper, closed the safe and twirled the nickel knob gaily. "I'm off too," he announced. "I'm going to leave the vault for you to close tonight, Miss Anne." He shrugged himself into his overcoat and departed stiffly. He had worked hard over his books that afternoon, and his legs and arms were aching in unison with his head. He came back for a moment to turn off some of the big lights. "No use wasting electricity," he explained. "No one will be in this evening, and a little girl like you can't use all this light." A minute later Anne heard the street door at the foot of the stairs close with a bang, and she was left all alone in the big office. She was not sorry to be alone. The day had been hard, and her nerves had been near the breaking point all the afternoon. The switchboard was Anne's special charge, but she also took care of the odds and ends of copywork and dictation for her busy associates. Odds and ends have a curious way of accumulating, and Anne seldom had a spare moment. "I am just dead tired," she declared aloud, raising her arms above her head in a vain effort to relieve their ache. "I am always snowed under with work. Yet no one seems to think I have anything to do. It's just, Miss Carstairs, will you copy that for me? I'll give you a letter now, Miss Carstairs, and you can run it off in your spare time. Spare time? Did anyone ever see me with a moment to spare? They don't think I amount to a row of pins, anyway. I'd just like to show them. I'd like to let Mr. Ross see that I do amount to something." Mr. Ross was the senior partner of the big manufacturing plant, and 18-year-old Anne admired him immensely. He was so calm, so quiet, and yet so forceful. A splendid business man, but one whose family's wants and wishes were cared for before all else. Anne knew he must be an ideal father, for he possessed all the qualities that Anne's own father had lacked. Mr. Carstairs had been far from an ideal parent and had ended his selfish, careless life just as Anne was preparing to enter college. Anne and her mother had bravely gathered together what money remained, and Anne started off to a business school instead. For 3 months she worked feverishly day and night, and at the end of that time, when their finances were in a precarious condition, she left the school to enter the manufacturing firm of Ross and Hayward. She had been there for nearly 2 years now, years of worry and careful planning to make the slender salary cover growing needs. We have almost proved that the necessities of life are unnecessary. So nearly we have come to getting along on next to nothing, she had laughingly told her mother only the evening before. But though she joked about it, the situation was becoming serious, and Anne had reached the place where she felt that she must steel herself to the point of asking for more wages. "Do people always have to ask for an increase?" she wondered. "Everybody here treats me as if I were a child, except when it comes to giving me work. That's a different matter." Anne did not as a rule complain about the amount of work she had to do. Instead, she was rather proud of being able to accomplish so much in a single day. To-night, however, she was tired and all out of sorts. She felt, too, that her looks were all against her. Curly hair and freckles, adding to a diminutive figure, gave her a decidedly childlike appearance. "I wish," she declared to herself, "I wish I were tall and had straight hair, and wrinkles around my mouth. What chance has anyone to advance when she is short and freckled? I just must make them sit up and take notice." She glanced around her with a proprietary look as she spoke. Her desk and switchboard were in the outer office, near the head of the short flight of stairs leading from the street door, and commanded a view of the entrance door and the stairway leading to the upper floors. At the extreme end of the room was the entrance to the stockroom, and beside it the great iron door leading to the vault where the business records were kept. In the dark corner by the vault door stood 2 tall piles of sales books. Since the bookkeeper had turned off the extra lights, the big office was lighted only by the globe above Anne's head. The heavy presses and machinery in the factory, running at full speed, shook the building, and their roar and clatter sounded unusually loud, now that the office was quiet. The switchboard was never busy after 5:30. And Anne leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them almost immediately with a start, suddenly aware of another presence in the big office. The new janitor, a scraggly feather duster in his hand, stood by her desk. "Do you want something?" Anne asked sharply. She did not approve of the new janitor. His hair was too long and shaggy, his chin too stubby, and his bushy eyebrows shaded eyelids that were drooped. His appearance was in accord with his shiftless way of dusting and sweeping, and thought with disfavor. Her voice was decidedly sharp as she asked again, "Do you want something?" "I wanted to see the cashier," the man answered. His drooping eyelids gave a peculiar, leering expression to his face that filled Anne with repulsion. Then she braced herself. No matter how afraid she was, he must not know it. "He has gone for the day. Come back in the morning," she said, turning to her typewriter to cut the conversation short. The man hesitated for a moment, but her preoccupied air chilled him, and Anne soon heard him walk away. At that moment a tall young woman came hurrying down the stairs from the upper floor. "I declare!" she cried, looking about the darkened office. "Everybody has gone home, and Mr. Bradford has locked the safe. Now will you tell me, Miss Carstairs, what am I going to do with all this money?" She waved a green cardboard box in the air as she spoke, her voice rising higher and higher in her agitation. "I have collected $800 on those Liberty Bond payments, and here Mr. Bradford has locked the safe and gone home. I'm going to the country to-night, and I can't take all this money with me." "Sh! Miss Benson," Anne warned, glancing quickly at the swing door that had not yet ceased swaying after the departing janitor. "Don't tell anyone. Can't you put it in the vault? Mr. Bradford left it for me to lock to-night." "But," Miss Benson objected, "something may happen to it, and I'm responsible. I can't take it with me, though. I have to put it in there, I guess. See, Miss Carstairs," she called a moment later from the depths of the vault, "I'm putting it beside the stamp box." With Miss Benson's departure, the big office suddenly seemed doubly large, and dim and empty. Anne shivered slightly, appalled by the fact that she was alone with $800 in cash in the open vault. The factory machinery made such a din that none of the employees could hear if she called for help. What would she do if the janitor had overheard Miss Benson and should make up his mind to steal the money? She glanced sharply at the swinging door. It was quiet now. She reassured herself. "I'm as nervous as Miss Benson. I'll just shut that vault now, though, and have it over with. It is almost 6 o'clock, anyway." At that moment a call came in on the telephone, the strident whir startling the girl with its suddenness. "Ross and Hayward," she answered mechanically into the receiver. "Miss Carstairs." It was Mr. Ross speaking. "I left a couple of Liberty Bonds in my desk. Please tell Bradford to put them into the safe." "Mr. Bradford has gone for the day, Mr. Ross," she answered, "but he has left the vault for me to close. I'll put them in." "All right. Put them in the stamp box. I guess they'll be all right there. Good night." Anne pulled out the plug and rose from her desk. Her rubber-soled shoes made no noise as she crossed the room. She found the bonds face down on Mr. Ross's desk, and as she picked them up, she could not fail to notice the denominations. She stared at them. $2,000! she whispered awestruck. "If only they were mine!" As she started to place them in the stamp box, its shabbiness caught her eye. She hesitated, then laid the bonds down. "I'll get a new box for the stamps," she decided, snapping off the light as she left the vault. Anne knew just where to find the particular box that she wanted, and did not stop to turn on the light as she entered the stockroom. She was in the act of reaching up for the box when the door stealthily opened. She shrank back against the shelves as the new janitor came in. He stopped for a moment and glanced around. Then a minute later Anne heard the snap of the electric button as the light in the vault was turned on. She gasped in dismay. The bonds and the Liberty Loan money were all in plain sight. For a brief moment the girl was paralyzed with fright. The janitor was after the money. She rushed forward. As she paused by the open doorway of the vault, she had a momentary glimpse of the janitor with the green box in one hand, and heard the familiar crackly paper of the bonds as he hurriedly thrust them in his pocket. In a panic she caught the huge iron door and slammed it shut, hurriedly throwing the big bolt in place. "I got him!" she gasped exultantly. But the words had not left her lips before she was knocked from her feet by a sudden blow on her shoulder. As she fell, another stunning blow came upon her head. A minute later, so it seemed to the girl, she opened her eyes to find Mr. Ross and his daughter Margaret bending over her. "She's coming to now." She could faintly hear Mr. Ross say, "Bathe her head some more." Then he added jokingly, "Well now, Miss Anne, you certainly gave us a start. What were you trying to do?" Anne's head ached agonizingly. She lifted her hand to her forehead and felt it gingerly. A lump as large as a walnut was there, just above the temple. She became aware now that the mist was fading from her eyes, and the ringing from her ears, that the factory was quiet. All the noise of the machinery had ceased. "What time is it?" she asked. And then, without waiting for an answer, "Where did you come from?" "It is after 8. We were driving by on our way to see a friend on the East Side, and I thought I would drop in and see if you had remembered to lock the safe." Mr. Ross laughed. "Fortunately for you that I doubted your ability." Anne raised her head and looked about her. Then she dropped it heavily back on the improvised pillow Miss Ross had tucked under her head. "It was that old sales book that knocked me down. It must have been on the edge of the pile and tipped over when I slammed the door." She felt a bump on her head again. "I suppose I hit the wrapping desk when I fell." "It wouldn't take much to knock out a little thing like you," Mr. Ross laughed. Anne opened her eyes again. A thought flashed through her mind, and she sat bolt upright on the floor. "Mr. Ross," she said, "can I prove to you I was big enough to save you $2,000? Would you think me big enough to be given an increase in salary?" "I sure would, Miss Carstairs," Mr. Ross answered, becoming suddenly grave. Anne's voice shook with excitement. "Your bonds are safe in the vault, Mr. Ross, together with $800 that Miss Benson collected on Liberty Loan payments, and the new janitor." "You're a very brave girl," said Mr. Ross, helping her to her feet. "The increase is yours. You have certainly earned it." "She was indeed a brave girl," said the Story King, as the Story Lady paused, "and deserved all her good fortune. The next," went on the Story Lady, smiling, "is the story of a young man and a young woman whose only ambition in life was to help others." End of section 30. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section 31 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Story Book by Jane Eyre Fryer. John and Margaret Peyton among savages. The tropical island of Aniwa drowsed in the afternoon sunshine. Long, lazy swells rolling in from the Pacific broke on the outlying reefs, overflowed into the turquoise bay, and gently lapped the stretch of sandy beach. The softest of breezes stirred the palm trees and rustled the banana thickets. Before the door of a low thatched hut, nestling under a clump of date palms, stood a fair-haired young woman anxiously watching a canoe which was making a perilous passage through the surf to the shelter of the bay. When at last it slid into the smooth water, she breathed a sigh of relief and went slowly down the hill toward the shore. The craft nosed stealthily up to the beach, where a stalwart, grave-faced white man sprang out. Then the boat, propelled by the muscular arms of two kinky-headed blacks, slipped away and vanished around a little promontory. "I'm glad you're safe home, John," the young woman cried, as the big man came swiftly toward her. "Is all well?" "Very far from that, Margaret," the newcomer answered, as he reached her side. "I found a great deal of unrest throughout the island." "Because of the drought?" "Yes," he replied, and stood looking down upon her thoughtfully. She came nearer and slipped her arm through his. "I can see that you are anxious, John," she said softly. "Do you fear an uprising?" "Margaret," he exclaimed, as they turned and began to climb the hill to the hut, "I should not have brought you here." "Oh!" she cried. "More than anything else, I desired the privilege of helping you in your work. Do you mean that I have failed? That I have proved a burden rather than a help?" "You know it is not that," he replied quickly. "You have been wonderful, dear, but I should not have allowed you to leave old Scotland for the hardships and perils of these heathen isles." "It has not been easy," she acknowledged, "but I have never once regretted coming." "I thought I was doing right to bring you," he went on, "but now—" "You feel," she interposed, "that we are in real danger?" "We shall be if the natives rise," he replied. "I think you should know the truth, dear." Her blue eyes darkened, but there was no fear in them. "But the people have come to feel we are their friends," she protested. "Some of them love us. Surely they will not harm us." By this time they had reached the hut. He put her gently into a camp chair before the door, and flung himself upon the white sand at her feet. "A trading ship touched on the other side of the island yesterday," he told her, "and paid for 500 pounds worth of sandalwood with a barrel of rum, I suppose," she commented. "They were little more generous this time," he replied grimly. "They left several barrels." "No wonder, then," she said, "that the people are mad to-day." "They also left," he continued, "in the mind of the old chief the impression that we missionaries are responsible for the drought." "Oh, too bad!" she exclaimed softly. "Yes," he agreed. "Old Namakei informed me just now that if another moon passes without rain, the island will have no more of our God or of us." "What did you answer?" she asked. "I told him," and he smiled, "that I would dig in the earth and reveal a place where God's rain is buried. He scoffed at first, but finally agreed to come with his warriors and help with the digging." "But John,"
she queried. "Will you really be able to dig a well on this island?" "Of course, I can't be certain," he answered, "but I've been studying the soil and it seems probable. Anyway, it's our one chance to appease the old chief's ire and continue our work." John Gibson Paton had come out to the New Hebrides some years before, and settled on the cannibal island of Tanna. He had begun at once to teach the people, and had succeeded in greatly improving their condition, when a trading vessel had brought measles to the island. An epidemic followed, and the natives died like flies. They were so bitterly angry against those who had brought the plague that they became suspicious of all white men, even the missionary who had always helped them, and he was finally obliged to flee for his life. With great difficulty he escaped to a passing ship bound for Australia. From Australia he went to his homeland, Scotland. He had a wonderfully happy time on this visit among his friends and relatives, for he was married to the pretty Scotch lassie whom he had learned to love. He felt that life would be very hard for her on the island of Tanna, and he decided to go, instead, to Anawa, where the natives were less fierce and more intelligent. Besides, they had asked that a missionary be sent to them. They were very glad when he came bringing his pretty wife, and they tried to learn all he told them. All went well until the traders, who came to the South Seas for sandalwood and coconuts and the rich tropical fruits, discovered that the natives were becoming more intelligent, and could not be cheated or swindled so easily since the missionaries were teaching them. So the traders made up their minds to try to turn the blacks against Dr. Paton and his wife and his native helpers. They had not been able to do much until the time of the long drought, told about at the beginning of this story. You see, they depended almost entirely upon rain for fresh water to drink. Never before in the memory of living men had the islands been so long without rain. The people were terrified and ready for any outbreak. But the young missionaries, sitting silently under the palms, realized that the traders might so excite the natives with their talk and with rum that they might become murderers and revert to cannibalism. "Where will you dig the well, John?" Margaret asked at length. "On the slope over there." He nodded toward the opposite hill. "I shall begin work to-morrow. Chief Namakei comes an hour after sunrise." "And if you succeed in reaching fresh water, shall we be safe?" "Yes, and if not, I hate to think of what may happen." "But anyway," she declared, "I am sure you will find God's rain, John." Weary days and nights followed. Days when the doctor and his band of native helpers dug from dawn to dark in the sandy soil. Nights when the young white people, too anxious to sleep, sat under their palm trees and watched while the moon sank into the sea, and the volcano of Tan, the lighthouse of the Pacific, flung its blazing banners high against the heavens. 2 weeks passed and the diggers found no water. Then one day the continued drought left the old chief's favorite water hole quite dry. On the same day the side of the new well caved in. The two troubles coming together turned the interest of Namakei to suspicion. When the digging began he forbade his men to take part in the work, and though he watched the other toilers, his beady eyes had the look of a hawk's just ready to pounce upon its prey. The moon was full before the cave-in was repaired. The next morning the two remaining helpers did not report for duty, and old Namakei told the doctor they would not come back. "They are my prisoners," he laughed. "If Missy Paton wished to help in finding the buried rain, let his God give it." "His God will give it," the missionary replied calmly. And alone Dr. Peyton went on with his undertaking. 2 days, 3 days passed, and still no water. Namakei assumed a more threatening attitude. "The moon wanes," he warned the missionary. Then one morning, when the doctor went down into the well, he saw something gleaming at his feet. He bent down, gazing with eager eyes. It was water. "But will it be fresh?" he asked himself, with a fast beating heart. So on tiny an island the sea water might easily penetrate the soil. Very slowly he dipped his finger into the now fast rising water, and lifted it to his lips. And then suddenly he sank down in the dampness, and wept like a child. The water was fresh and pure and sweet. God's rain indeed. By noonday the well was filled with the life-giving water, and from every part of the island the natives gathered to behold the miracle of the rain which had come up from the earth instead of down from the sky, and to do honor to Missy Peyton who had given it to them. And when he assured them that it would always be there, so long as the island remained in the sea, and that drought would nevermore bring suffering and distress among them, they kissed his hands in gratitude. Never again did evil words of the traders against their beloved Missy have any weight with the natives of Anawa, and never again did they turn away from the Christian religion and the Christian God. And if you should visit the island today, you would be shown by the proud people the well where John Gibson Peyton found by faith and prayer and labor the buried blessing so many years ago. Again the Story People clapped their hands as the story ended, for they loved to hear nothing better than brave and unselfish deed. "That is a good story," said Mary Frances. "Yes," said the Story King. "The stories of those who risk their lives for others are the best of all our stories." "Yes," agreed the Story Queen, "they are the best of all." "Now," said the Story Lady, "we come to our fourth story." End of section 31. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section number 32 of the Mary Frances Story Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Mary Frances Story Book by Jane Eyre Fryer. The Strange Guest. On the summit of one of the heights of a wild country district along the Rhine there stood many years ago an old castle. In this castle lived a beautiful maiden with her father and two elderly aunts. Her father was a jolly old nobleman, very fond of his beer, and very fond of hearing himself talk, too. He enjoyed his own jokes better than anyone else, perhaps. Even so, his dearest possession was his beautiful daughter, his only child. He loved her as the apple of his eye, and wished to give her all happiness. She had little chance of being lonely, for there were always a large number of poor relatives visiting the nobleman, and indeed they made these visits so long that they sometimes stayed for years. She often wondered, however, who might be living in the castle on the heights across the valley. She could just see the outlines of the walls and towers on clear days, from the balcony outside her bedroom window. "Father," she said one day, "could we not ride over to the castle some time? I'm forever dreaming stories about those who live within it." A heavy cloud settled over her father's countenance. "Never let me hear you mention of it again, my daughter," he thundered. And of course she said no more, but she spoke about it to one of her aunts that evening. "Dear aunt, why was my father vexed when I mentioned that castle this morning?" she asked, pointing out of her window. "Hush, my child," replied the aunt. "There is a feud between the two families." "A feud?" questioned the maiden. "A feud? Why, we do not even know them. How can there be a feud?" "It dates back to the time of our great great grandfathers," her aunt told her, "and no loyal member of this family would ever have anything to do with a member of that family. Never mention the matter again." Then suddenly, changing the subject, "Do you finish your embroidery stint for to day? How far have you worked? Let me see." The maiden blushed, arose, and brought a large sheet of unfinished tapestry to her aunt, which she unfolded before her. Her aunt put on her spectacles to examine the work. "Wait!" she exclaimed. "I'll call my sister." The other aunt was in the doorway, however, and joined in examining the work. "I see a misstitch here," she commented. "Ah, yes, and a loose end there," added the other. "It is growing dark. No knowing how many flaws we would find by daylight. To morrow you will do better, I hope." "I will try," promised the niece. And so the maiden grew. By the time she was 18, she could not only embroider tapestries and play a dozen airs on her guitar and harp, but could write a short note, with no more than 10 misspelled words, and could sign her own full name without missing a letter. These accomplishments, in that day, were considered quite a finished education for a young lady. On her 18th birthday, the castle was in bustling excitement, because there was to be an affair of utmost importance. And this affair was none other than a great family gathering to receive the intended bridegroom of the maiden. Her father had promised her in marriage to the son of an old nobleman, a friend of his who lived in a distant province. The parents had arranged all the details, and the young people were engaged to be married without even seeing each other. The time was appointed for the wedding, which was to take place at the home of the maiden on her 18th birthday. The bridegroom had already set out on his journey and was expected to arrive at any moment. The castle was in tumult. The fair bride had been decked out with uncommon care. Her aunts had quarreled about every article of her dress, and while they were quarreling she had made up her own mind about each article she would wear. The result was that she looked as lovely as a dream. The soft luster of her eyes, the rose petal hue of her cheeks, the quick rise and fall of her bosom showed the excitement in her heart. Meanwhile, her aunts gave her all kinds of directions as to her behavior. "When you first see him, my dear niece," advised one aunt, "lower your eyes, as becomes a modest young lady." "Yes," added the other aunt, "and when you curtsy, catch your skirts so," and she made a deep old-fashioned bow. The old baron was no less busy with preparations than the others. Having, in fact, nothing to do but wait, he worried everybody else about every detail. He wandered from the top to the bottom of the castle, begging everybody to be diligent, and filling everybody with anxiety. He was naturally a bustling little man, and he buzzed about in every hall and chamber like a blue-bottle fly on a warm summer's day. In the meantime, things had been gathered together for the making of a great feast. The forest had rung with the sound of the huntsman's horn, the kitchen was crowded with good cheer, and the castle was a model of ancient hospitality. The long tables had been spread with the handsomest trenchers and dishes within the castle.
The last finishing touches had been added to the wedding gown. The bride waited trembling with anxious expectation. Everything was ready to receive the distinguished guest, but the guest did not come. Hour after hour rolled by. The sun began to set, and the baron mounted for the 11th time the high tower, and strained his eyes in hope of catching sight of the count and his attendants. Once he thought he saw them, for there were a number of men seen advancing slowly on horseback, but when they had nearly reached the foot of the mountain, they suddenly struck off in a different direction. The last rays of the sun departed. The bats began to flit by in the twilight. The road grew dimmer and dimmer to sight, and nothing seemed to be stirring in it except, now and then, a peasant lagging homeward from his day's labor. While the old castle was in this nervous state, very different things were happening to the bridegroom. The young count was riding along on horseback in a jog-trot fashion toward the bride he had never seen. "There is no haste necessary," he said to his attendants. "We will be there in all good time. Let us enjoy the scenery." At the inn where he stopped for refreshment, he met another young nobleman with whom he had been good friends several years before while both were in the army. "And which way do you travel?" asked the count's friend. "We go through the east pass, and upward through the mountain road," he replied. "How fortunate!" exclaimed his friend. "I am going in the same direction." So they agreed to travel together, and soon set off, the count leaving word for his servants to follow and overtake him later. "Now tell what has happened in your life since we last met," said the count's friend as their horses stepped out abreast. "Has your heart been touched by the beauty of any maiden?" Then the count told him about his coming wedding with a young lady he had never seen, but who was said to be very lovely. In this way they entered one of the loneliest and most thickly wooded passes in the mountains. All this happened in the days when bands of robbers lived in the woods, and when ghosts were said to haunt old castles. As the count turned to speak to his companion, suddenly from out of the woods there sprang a small band of robbers who immediately attacked them. They made a brave fight, but were nearly overcome by the numbers when the count's retinue of servants came riding up. The robbers fled at sight of them, but not until they had given the count a dreadful wound. He was carried back to the nearest town, through which he had so joyfully ridden such a short while before. A priest, who was also quite a doctor, was brought to his bedside, but everyone knew that the poor young count's moments were few to live in this world. He motioned his friend near, and whispered between gasping breaths, "I beg you to go to the castle of my betrothed, and tell why I did not keep my appointment." Then gathering strength, he added in a stronger voice, "Unless this is done, I shall not sleep quietly in my grave." He spoke so solemnly that his friend gave his promise without hesitating. This seemed to soothe him, and he closed his eyes as if in sleep, but he soon began to talk wildly, and call for his horse, saying he must hasten to the home of his bride, and thinking he was leaping into his saddle, he suddenly drew his last breath. His friend was deeply grieved. His heart was heavy within him. He scarcely knew how to keep his promise, for he was the son of the nobleman whose castle the maiden had been forbidden to mention. And because of the feud between the two families, he hated all the more to be the bearer of such bad news. Still, he thought that he would like to see the lovely girl, and he felt that he must try to carry out the promise he had made to his dying friend. So he made arrangements for the poor count's burial in the cathedral near the graves of his noble ancestors,
and set out on his journey. It is now high time that we should return to the castle, where everybody was hungrily awaiting their guest. Night closed in, but still no guest arrived. The baron descended from the high tower in despair. "It is so dark that I can see nothing now," he said. "There is no use in watching longer." The banquet had been postponed from hour to hour. The cooks in the kitchen were desperate. The meats were already overdone, and everyone was beginning to look as though it were a time of famine. "We can delay no longer," the baron finally said. "I fear we must proceed with the feast without our guest." All were seated at the table and on the point of commencing, when the sound of a horn from outside the gate gave notice that a stranger was approaching. Another long blast filled the old courts of the castle with its echoes, and was answered by the warden from the walls. The baron hastened to receive his future son-in-law. The drawbridge had been let down, and the stranger was before the gate. He was a tall, gallant cavalier, mounted on a beautiful black steed. His face was pale. He had a gleaming eye, and yet wore an air of sadness. The baron was a little embarrassed to think that he should come in so simple a way without a retinue of friends and servants. He thought that the young count did not show proper appreciation of the honor of marrying his daughter, but he comforted himself by thinking, "He has been so anxious to see his bride that he has hurried off without waiting for attendants." "I am sorry," began the stranger, "to break in upon you at such an hour." "Oh, pray do not worry," interrupted the baron. "It is as nothing." And he continued with a world of compliment and greeting, for, to tell the truth, the baron was very proud of his ability to make pretty speeches. He kept on talking so fast that the stranger was unable to put a word in edgewise, and by the time he paused they had reached the inner court of the castle. The stranger was again about to speak when he was once more interrupted by a group of the baron's relatives leading forth the blushing bride. The Wedding Feast. The stranger gazed on her for a moment as one entranced. It seemed as if his whole soul beamed forth in the gaze, and rested upon her beauty. One of the maiden aunts whispered something in her ear. She made an effort to speak. Her moist blue eyes were timidly raised, gave a shy glance to the stranger, and were cast again to the ground. Her words died away, but there was a sweet smile playing about her lips, and a soft dimpling of the cheek showed that she was pleased to meet so charming a person. The late hour at which the guests arrived left no time to talk. The stranger attempted again to tell his sad news, but the baron would not listen, and immediately led the way to the untasted banquet. A feast was served in the great hall of the castle. Around the walls hung the portraits of the bride's ancestors, and the horns and tusks of animals they had killed in the hunt. Armor and spears and torn banners hung next to jaws of wolves and tusks of boars, and spears and battle axes. A large pair of antlers hung just over the head of the youthful bridegroom. The stranger took but little notice of the company or of the entertainment. He scarcely tasted the banquet, but seemed absorbed in admiring the bride. He talked with her in a low tone that could not be overheard. The bride's color came and went, and she listened to him with deep attention. Now and then she made some reply, but she was very quiet most of the time, and when his glance was turned she looked at him with much pleasure. "They have fallen in love at first sight," whispered one aunt. "I felt that it would be so," said the other. The feast went on merrily, or at least noisily, for the guests were all blessed with large appetites. The baron told his longest and best stories. If he told anything marvelous, his hearers were lost in astonishment. If he told anything funny, they laughed just loud and long enough to praise him greatly. Amidst all this frolic, the stranger seemed lost in thought. His only conversation was with the bride, and seemed to grow more and more earnest and mysterious. Clouds began to steal over her fair face, and the guests noticed that she trembled. Their gaiety was chilled by such actions. The song and laughter grew less and less frequent. There were pauses in the conversation. Dismal stories were told by several people. The baron nearly frightened some of the ladies into hysterics with the history of the ghost horseman that carried away the fair young woman Lenora. The bridegroom listened to this tale with great attention. He kept his eye fixed on the baron, and, as the story grew to a close, began gradually to rise from his seat, growing taller and taller until, to the baron's eye, he seemed almost to tower into a giant. The moment the tale was finished, he heaved a deep sigh, and took a solemn farewell of the company. They were all in amazement. The baron was perfectly thunderstruck. "What! Going to leave the castle at midnight? Why, everything is ready for your reception. A room is ready for you if you wish to retire." The stranger shook his head mournfully, and said, "I must lay my head in a different place to night." Then waving his farewell to the company, he stalked slowly out of the hall. The maiden aunts seemed to turn to stone. The bride hung her head, and a tear stole down her cheek. The baron followed the stranger to the great court of the castle, where the black horse stood pawing the earth, snorting with impatience. When they reached the portal, whose deep, high archway was dimly lighted by a lantern, the stranger paused and spoke to the baron in a hollow tone of voice. "Now that we are alone," said he, "I will tell you my reason for leaving. I have an engagement in—" "Why," asked the baron, "cannot you send some one in your place?" "I must keep this engagement myself. I must go myself." "Ay," said the baron, "but not until to morrow. To morrow you shall take your bride there." "No, no," replied the stranger with great solemnity. "My engagement is with no bride. The grave awaits me. I must go back where I came from." He sprang upon his black charger, dashed over the drawbridge, and the sound of the clatter of the horse's hoofs were lost in the whistling of the night's blast. The baron watched him until out of sight, then muttered, "He must have been a ghost." He returned to the hall in great bewilderment, and related what had just passed. Two ladies fainted, others sickened with the idea of having banqueted with a spectre. The company tried to guess whose ghost it might have been. Some talked of wood demons, and others of mountain sprites, but all were dim uncertainty and mystery. The next morning, however, put an end to guessing, for word came of the death of the young count on his way to the castle, and every one felt sure that the stranger of the night before was indeed his spectre. You can imagine how dreadful the baron felt. He shut himself up in his rooms. His guests stayed on, for they could not think of going when he was in such trouble; and then, too, the remnants of the feast were to be eaten and drunk. But the poor bride was most to be pitied. To have lost a promised husband before she was acquainted with him, and such a husband, everybody wept for her. The Midnight Music. On the night of the second day after, she retired to a room with one of her aunts who insisted upon sleeping with her. The aunt was one of the best tellers of ghost stories in all the land, and in telling one of her longest, fell asleep in the midst of it. The room was in a distant corner of the castle, and overlooked a small garden. The niece lay gazing at the beams of the rising moon as they shone on the trembling leaves of an aspen tree before the latticed window. The castle clock had just tolled midnight when a soft strain of music stole up from the garden. She rose hastily from her bed, and stepped lightly to the window. A tall figure stood among the shadows of the trees. As it raised its head, a beam of moonlight fell on its face. In a moment she knew him, her promised bridegroom. A loud shriek at that moment burst upon her ear, and her aunt, who had been awakened by the music and had followed her to the window, fell into her arms. When she looked again, the spectre had disappeared. Of the two, the aunt required the more soothing. She was beside herself with terror. As for the young lady, she did not feel frightened. There was something, even in the spectre of her lover, very charming. The aunt declared she would never sleep in that room again. The niece for once was determined to have her own way, and declared she would not sleep in any other room. The consequence was that she had to sleep there alone. She begged her aunt to promise not to tell about this moonlight visitor, for she said it was the only comfort she had in her great disappointment, and the good old lady promised. How long she would have kept her promise is uncertain, for she dearly loved to talk about mysterious happenings. She did keep it to herself for a whole week, and then, suddenly, she did not need to keep it longer, for word was brought to the breakfast table that the young lady was not to be found. Her room was empty. Her bed had not been slept in. The window was open. The bird had flown. Nearly every one was struck speechless, when the aunt who had slept with her suddenly regained her speech, and wringing her hands, shrieked out, "The goblin! The goblin! She's carried away by the goblin!" In a few words she told of the dreadful scene in the garden, and all concluded that the spectre must have carried off his bride. Two of the servants said they had heard the clatter of a horse's hoofs down the mountain side about midnight, and had no doubt it was the black charger of the spectre. The poor baron was inconsolable. What sorrow to have his only child, his daughter, carried off by a goblin! How terrible to have, perhaps, goblin grandchildren! As usual, he was completely bewildered, and all the castle was in an uproar. The men were ordered to take horses, and hunt in every road and path and byway. The baron himself had just drawn on his jack-boots and girded on his sword, when he glanced out the window, and paused because of what he saw. A lady was approaching the castle on horseback. Beside her, mounted on a black charger, was a cavalier. She galloped up to the gate, sprang from the horse, and running into the castle, fell at the baron's feet. It was his lost daughter, and her companion, the spectre bridegroom. The baron was astonished. He looked at his daughter, then at the spectre, and almost doubted his eyes. The spectre was wonderfully improved in appearance. His dress was splendid, and set off his noble figure. He was no longer pale and sad. His face was flushed with the joy of youth. The mystery was soon cleared up. The cavalier, for you must have known all along he was no goblin, told the whole story, how he had met his young friend, how they had traveled together, how the young nobleman had met his death. He said that the sight of the beautiful young lady had made him forget everything except the desire to be near her. At first, when the baron would not listen to his explanation, he thought it would do no harm to accept the situation as it was. If the baron's family had not had a feud with his own family, he would have explained everything after the banquet, but he feared that under the circumstances he might never see the young lady again. When the baron had told how the fairy Lenora had been carried off by the goblin, the idea of being a goblin himself came to him, and he said that he did not feel exactly right about doing this, but his friends had told him to remember the old saying that everything was fair in love. The baron pardoned the young couple on the spot. The festival at the castle was continued. Only the aunt was disappointed. She who had told so many stories about true ghosts was embarrassed to find the only ghost which she had actually seen should turn out to be a real live person. But she was so happy at having her niece back again that her embarrassment was as nothing. But the niece was perfectly happy in having found him a real living person, and, since they lived happily ever after, here the story ends. "And another begins," added the Story Lady, after a slight pause. At the Story King's nod of approval, she proceeded. End of section 32. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.